What's your agenda? How can you make sure the issues you care about get in front of the decision makers and the policy makers in our community and our country? How can you make sure you're in the room where those decisions get made? Let's find out. Let us now make our voices heard. I pledge to serve and to push my country. I pledge to live like a citizen. Welcome to Citizen University TV. I'm Eric Liu. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the topic of civic agenda setting. It was JFK who said that to govern is to choose among competing priorities, among a cacophony of lobbyists and advocates trying to get the attention of policymakers. And this process of how choices get made, how certain things get put on the agenda or left off the agenda, is one that is mysterious to many citizens. And so what we want to do today is just dive deep into this topic and break down what it means to set the agenda and to get onto the agenda of our policymakers and our decision makers. There are three different dimensions to this question, and we're going to talk about each one of them. The first is simply this: who decides? Who's in the room where it happens? Who makes the choices? The second, then, is what issues get decided? What makes it onto the docket and what gets left off, either because it had to and there was no time or because someone really tried hard to keep it off the agenda. And then number three, how are these decisions made? What's the rule set that determines the ways in which these choices and priorities get determined? Now, all three of these things touch on each other and interlock with one another, but let's talk about each one in turn. We'll start with who decides. So the question of who decides really is very fundamental to politics. You have to ask yourself, as a citizen, if you're trying to push a certain issue onto the media and the political agenda, who do I need to persuade? Sometimes it's the vote of all the people, so you've got to persuade all your fellow citizens. But much of the time in politics, it's some smaller subset of people. Maybe it's elected representatives on different issues. Maybe it's people who serve in an appointed body, and you got to figure out, who do I have to talk to? And most of the time in politics, that's a very outside game. It's public. They're in an arena. They're holding public meetings that are getting televised where an audience is welcome, and you can identify, okay, that's policymaker X, that's decision maker Y. But there's another dimension of who, and that is really the question of who's behind closed doors? Who's not sitting necessarily at the city council chambers? Who's not sitting in the legislative chambers? Who actually might be the power behind the throne? Maybe it's a really influential aide. Maybe it's a spouse or a loved one or a friend of a decision maker or a policy maker. Maybe it's a really effective lobbyist. All these people who might have access to the decision makers are as crucial to this question of who as those who have the formal authority and title. Understanding this informal, closed-door dimension of the who is really important. And as a citizen, we're not taught this. We're certainly not taught it in civics class. But anybody who knows how to make stuff happen in politics quickly figures out that this closed-door dimension, the inside game, is really crucial to making sure that your issues get onto the agenda. Well, that brings us to the second dimension of civic agenda setting, and that is this: what issues are decided? Now, the what is really self-explanatory in many ways. There is an infinite, limitless number of issues that can make it onto an agenda. Maybe it's the flat tax, maybe it's marriage equality, maybe it's gender identity and public restrooms, maybe it's gun control. All of these questions are competing for the finite, limited attention of policymakers. And so when you think about what can make its way on there, what you're looking at here with all of these issues, imagine people, organizations, and advocacy groups behind each one of these things. This is the jostle and the bustle of politics. This is what Madison called the battle of factions. Factions fighting for attention, trying to get their issues onto the agenda, trying to get the attention of media and public alike. And one of the things that you have to recognize when you think about what finally makes it onto the agenda is not only to see at any given legislative session or a meeting of a legislative body what's on that piece of paper that says, today we shall consider A, B, C, and D, right? But to recognize that for everything that makes it onto the agenda, a bunch of things didn't, right? So for instance, in the question of health insurance, yeah, maybe with Obamacare, we talked about health insurance subsidies and this big system of health insurance subsidies, but what never quite made it fully onto the legislative agenda was the broader question of should we have a single-payer healthcare system, government-run Medicare for all style healthcare? On the question of taxes, for instance, people have been advocating for a flat tax, and there have been various legislative proposals that have moved somewhat down the path of becoming law. But no one really has been successful at making outright abolishment of the IRS truly a likely political outcome. Why is that? Why do certain things make it? And that's partly a matter of choice and priority. But then there are other issues altogether, like why don't we have in the United States state ownership of the means of production? That issue never gets on the agenda, even in Seattle where we have a socialist city council member. Why? Because even apart from the choice making that happens when you have agendas in legislative bodies like this, there's another dimension of the what, and that is about ideology. In a society like ours, that is a capitalist society, people in legislative roles and in politics don't really think about the possibility of something that is non-capitalist. They might think about how to adjust capitalism. They might think about how to tame or contain capitalism, but it's not really on the agenda in our national political system to say, you know what, let's scrap capitalism. Let's do full-on socialism and communism. Now, that really is a malleable thing. You could imagine a time in our politics where maybe that does become more plausible a thing that's on the agenda. But today, it is not. And so it's really important for us to understand as citizens not only what makes it onto the docket, but what doesn't, and to think about why that is. Why it is that certain things get there and don't get there. Well, that brings us to the third dimension of civic agenda setting, and that's this question of how. How are things decided? What is the rule set? And in any public decision-making arena, you'll have rules that are laid down, universal rules that must be applied universally. Sometimes, certainly in most legislative bodies, you have a rule of majority rule. The idea of 50% plus one of the representatives shall determine whether something is yea or nay. Yet even here, of course, sometimes it requires a supermajority. If you want to pass a treaty in the United States Senate, that's 2/3. If you want to pass a constitutional amendment, that's 2/3. So it's not always majority rule, but then sometimes it's not always about our elected representatives either. There are appointed bodies. Here in the city, you have things like the library board. You have other commissions in our national government that are not elected representatives, and yet still here you have to think about what are the rules that they operate by. Is it a majority of those folks? Is it unanimity? What are the ways in which these bodies operate? And of course, you also have in another branch of government, judges. Judges making law, judges making rules. And here, it's a totally different arena and game. For us as citizens to understand this dimension of what are the rules requires us to think with a little bit of civic imagination. We tend, anytime we go into any game, could be a baseball game, a sports game, could be a board game, but certainly the game of politics, we tend to take as given the rule set that we inherit. But we have to remember, there's nothing given here. Just because we've always elected city council members and state legislators and members of Congress by a first past the post, 50% plus one winner takes all rule, doesn't mean that we have to forever. We could change that rule set so that it became a matter of proportional representation, so that you could have something like they have in other countries where you have a whole group of parties, not just two parties represented in the legislative body. Those are all questions of rules. And, you know, on one level, this sounds like a big yawner, these parliamentary questions of how do you design rules? How do you make sure that those rules are applied neutrally and fairly? But this is the game. Anywhere you go in politics, certainly in any legislative body, there's always something like a rules committee. As we think about the presidential campaigns that are unfolding and the presidential conventions, they have rules committees, and those rules determine how delegates get allocated, how delegates get seated. And as everybody knows right now, that is a contentious set of questions. And if you control the rules, you control the game. You control the flow of the game and the set of possible outcomes. So as citizens, we have to both be literate in that rule set and figure out ways that we can actually influence it. Well, here in our own city, there's a whole set of issues where you can see all of these dimensions of civic agenda setting in action. But there's one in particular that I think is really emblematic of the who and the what and the how of civic agenda setting. And that's a youth participatory budgeting project. It goes by the name in our city of Youth Voice, Youth Choice. And what participatory budgeting does, in short, is the city council sets aside a pot of money, and in this case grants a group of citizens, young citizens here, the power to decide how shall they spend that money. How shall they set priorities? How shall they allocate those funds? On what issues, on what concerns, and by what rules? And this example of participatory budgeting is a great case study. So let's take a deeper dive into youth voice, youth choice.
This project will benefit kids in the South.
Given what they do,
Do you see many murals in the South End?
No, but I wish there were.
what could they do with another, say, $50,000?
Something that will have a positive impact for that year.
Do that.
Yay, thank you.
Today we're having a meeting on our youth budget delegate. I'm on the Parks and Rec Committee.
I'm on the Health and Human Services Committee, and right now we're looking at funding a couple different things, mostly focused on homeless youth in Seattle.
So we have $700,000 to spend on things that the city needs or that would be beneficial to people, less fortunate people in Seattle, specifically youths.
Participatory budgeting is a new program. Youth all throughout the city get to think of ideas and pitch proposals and ultimately vote and determine how they spend this money.
Violence prevention.
A graffiti-free wall.
Workshops provided after schools or at community centers.
Education for juvenile detention centers.
I don't know anyone who would hate kids making movies.
I think it's a demographic we always talk about, and when we convene meetings and whatnot, it's a voice that's not often at the table. That group, that demographic, 18 to 24, they're most impacted by a lot of policies that we do.
A sound studio can give classes and job training for youth in media and design fields.
Well, I like that.
All right, then I think you should write that.
I got involved in this project because I wanted to be more involved in my community because I didn't see a lot of people like me involved in the community, so I wanted to be a change. Growing up, I had old parks, and I want to have kids have new parks.
The waste bucket / recycling can / compost bin decoration thing.
Would that be of interest to you? Could that benefit the city?
I think it's important because the kids hardly ever get a voice in this kind of thing, and I think it's really important that the kids actually get a say in what's going on in our city and how to spend this money. My committee is the Parks and Rec Committee.
There's 6 buckets, and it very much mirrors what our budget is. There's arts, there's neighborhoods and development, there's homeless. We have a lot of issues in housing and homelessness, a lot of social justice, environmental.
So hope beds provide that space for people under 18.
Today we narrowed down the proposals from about 100 down to 4. Now we're writing the proposals up, writing why it's important, what we need to do to accomplish it. Is it feasible? And then later in the couple weeks, we'll get feedback from the city.
Once the ideas are collected and the voting, we're gonna see how much we can accomplish with that $700,000 award. There could be 3 large projects, there could be 10 smaller projects.
There's a way in which it feels like, from the outside, looking at a process like this, it seems mysterious and how does that happen? How do people make ideas actually realized? And really, you just do it. You just kind of do it. And I feel like that's a lot of what I'm getting. You want something to happen, you just have to do it.
This is the first year they're doing it, and I think it's a really good idea.
What's happening in Seattle with youth participatory budgeting is part of a broader movement that's both national and, in fact, global, where people are really taking control over this question of the who, the what, and the how of public decision-making. But behind all of it, of course, is the work of organizing people in the first place to understand these elements of agenda setting and to practice them. And so one of the great practitioners in our community of this art is my friend Estela Ortega, who's the executive director of El Centro de la Raza. And Estela, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Eric. Thank you.
You know, El Centro de la Raza has been around in the community for so many decades now, many years. But I want to hear a little bit about how, from the very beginning, your origins, you and the late Roberto Maestas, your husband, who helped create this, how you went about the work of trying to change and set the agenda in this city and beyond about the issues that you care about?
Well, thank you. Well, basically, I mean, first of all, we have to point out that the struggle that El Centro de la Raza went through in occupying a building was led by Chicano Latinos, but supported by communities of color. And that was extremely crucial, and that was built on relationships before the founding of El Centro that we referred to the four amigos, Bernie Whitebear, Roberto, Larry Gossett, and who am I forgetting? I guess Roberto.
Uncle Bob Santos.
Oh, Bob Santos, yes. They worked together, and so those relationships were created. And so community organizing is about relationships also. So when, the decision was made to occupy the building.
And this was in what year?
This was in 1972, the fall of 1972. And the mobilization not only included Latinos, but it also included organizing communities of color in the progressive white community.
And this is worth making express, because to many people, particularly who maybe have only been in Seattle a short number of years, Centro de la Raza is up there on Beacon Hill, and it has this great big building. But people may not know that that building had been an empty Seattle Public Schools space, and that you all had to, in the first place, occupy it in order to draw attention to the issues that your community and the wider communities of color were concerned about in the city.
Exactly. I mean, people did try to have meetings with, the district to see about leasing, etc., and there wasn't any movement. And said, okay, the building is there. And Dan Evans was our governor at the time. And a lot of school buildings were being abandoned for more modern buildings. And he said, the communities should make use of those school buildings. And so folks said, that's our cue. That is our cue to occupy this building.
He probably didn't mean for that to happen, but...
Right, and then there was the experience, too, of Native Americans in the area that Bernie Whitebear in 1970 had occupied Fort Lawton, for the use of services for Native Americans, Alcatraz in California, I think 1969. So there was examples, and of course, occupations that were also happening at the University of Washington.
So fast forward a little bit. I mean, this seminal moment in the first place of occupying a space, which led ultimately to a deal being struck where your organization was able to in a sense, lease the space at a very low rate. And from there, the foundations of this organization were built. Now, fast forward a little bit to some other pivotal moments in the life of El Centro, where you had to kind of figure out, how do you navigate the decision-making, the agenda-setting systems of government, both at the city and the state and even the national level?
Well, I think part of it, El Centro de la Raza is a 501c3, and there are stipulations that you cannot support political candidates, etc. And the reality is that those candidates, whether they become politicians, they're in city council, county council, the governor, state legislators, those are the people that make decisions about who's going to receive funding or whatever issue, that people may be working on. And yet you're told, don't have relationships with them. And you essentially, as a community-based organization, have to have relationships with those people. You need to be present. They need to get to know you. And so, again, that is sort of the first rule of community organizing, is creating relationships with people within all those different sectors. And at the same time, it's not only the politicians that you're needing to create relationships, but it's also with communities of color, other people that are doing similar work, that you're supporting their issues, they're supporting you, you're building relationships that when an action or a mobilization needs to happen, you can call on those trusted allies.
And as you all have built not only the wide portfolio of social and civic services that you all offer, but also have taken on some more ambitious projects in the community, you've had to read that map of who makes decisions and who influences decisions. You're in the midst right now, as we speak, of preparing to launch a big new project, Plaza Roberto Maestas, in memory of Roberto. Tell us a little bit about how what the project is and how it came to be, again, in the sense of how you read that map of relationships and power in a way to help make this venture possible.
Well, Plaza Roberto Maestas is a mixed-use development that consists of 112 units of affordable housing. There's retail space, office space. We're expanding our early childhood development with classrooms. There is a commercial kitchen that small businesses will be able to use in the evening, especially those who cook. There are there's going to be a space for micro businesses and even a farmer's market there. And so when the opportunity presented itself for us, well, one is that light rail was going to make a stop now on Beacon Hill, and that was not the plan before. And so El Centro de la Raza thought, okay, we're going to have light rail. We've got an acre of land. What do we do? And at that same time, the city of Seattle was like, okay, we now have to upzone the areas. We've got to get input from people. And no one expected us to say, put the acre of land in the mixed city of Seattle, because we want to get input from the community on what they wanted to see on Beacon Hill. And we knew that if we received input from people and we were being very transparent in that way, we were going to end up having a lot of support for the community to do what we wanted to do there. And part of that is that we didn't go into it blindly. We knew that we had to also mobilize our people who lived on Beacon Hill, people who sought services at Beacon Hill, people who worked on Beacon Hill that were friendly to El Centro. We knew that we needed to mobilize them to be a part of that process also. So within that, obviously, hundreds and hundreds of people were involved in the process.
And the process meant actually bringing this project idea to the attention of who? City council, state legislature? I mean,
it was a combination of, it was the city council, it was the state legislature, it was the governor, because we knew that we were going to be seeking resources from all of those entities. And so
you're saying one of the ways that you were successful in getting this project onto these various agendas of these bodies was, in the first place, having done what maybe some insiders didn't expect you to do, which is to throw it open to your community and invite their hopes and dreams and ideas, so that you would build kind of a popular base for this. And so then it wasn't just an idea that Estela had and blueprints on paper. It was, here's the will of the people.
Exactly.
And now, we're kind of thrusting ourselves onto the docket, right?
And it was referred to as community inspired transit-oriented development as well.
Community-inspired transit-oriented development. Okay.
Absolutely.
Say that 5 times fast.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you do that kind of community-inspired work, again, that we can joke about what a mouthful that is, but a lot of decision-making in political life, whether at the city level or national, isn't often community-inspired, right? There's often kind of a show of, give us your opinions, but the way that you all went about designing and deciding what the priorities would be in the development of Plaza, you all reached out to your base of members of the community.
Right, and I also want to say that it's not in a vacuum, that in terms of people who are listening to this and thinking all of a sudden, okay, we're going to go organize. You have to have some credibility behind you that you have been doing this work, that you've been creating relationships, so that when you need to take that kind of a step, people are going to want to listen and be involved in that process. So yes, we went to the different sectors and mobilized, and clearly if it would have been just one person's idea, there's no way that it would have moved forward. But it moved forward, one might say, because of the power of the people, if you will, and that there were so many people involved and invested and wanting the project to materialize.
Well, the work that you all have been doing at El Centro de la Raza is a great fusion of both this spirit of understanding how agendas get set, but also understanding the power of participation and the way these two things mesh. So Estela, thank you so much for joining us and sharing a little bit about what you do and how we can actually make sure that we, the people, set more of the agenda.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thanks for being here. As we learn from these case studies about youth participatory budgeting and the work of El Centro, it really underscores the ways in which we can influence who decides, what issues are decided, and how they're decided. And one of the things that really connected those two case studies was the centrality of relationships. Having relationships, being able to read the map of relationships so that you can influence all three of these dimensions is really important. Well, relationships matter to us as well here at this show, and our relationship to you, the viewers. And that's why every episode we take a couple of questions that have come in from you via social media. The first one from Liana is this: what are the pros and cons of caucusing versus primaries? It's a great and very timely question. And in short, really, caucuses give us this opportunity to have face-to-face, old-fashioned town meeting style persuasion of people. But the downside of caucuses is that they're not necessarily representative of the community. Only some people may have the wherewithal, the resources, the knowledge to actually show up for a caucus, where many others will be left out. Primaries are sort of the inverse. They are potentially, at least, broadly representative because anybody can vote in a primary who's eligible, but they lose that dimension of community, of face-to-face participation and engagement. And the question as we weigh these pros and cons simply is, which form has more legitimacy? The outcomes of each are interesting and you can count the votes, but you really understand when you have one rule set versus another that maybe one gives you a different kind of legitimacy, a different kind of representation based on whether people got to participate or whether they got to really engage one another in conversation. The second question we got came from Dave on Facebook, and it's super interesting. How do certain roads and bridges make it into the massive transportation bill while others are left off? That's sort of a classic statement of the agenda-setting question. What's in, what's out? And you know, the federal transportation bill, this massive, massive piece of legislation, going back to 2010, they changed the rules on this. There used to be things called earmarks, where individual members of Congress could drop in funding for their pet projects, most infamously this bridge to nowhere in Alaska. But in 2010, when the Tea Party came in, they changed those rules. They stopped earmarks. And so the upside of these new rules is there's a lot more focus on data and rational argument and what works and what should be justified as fundable. The downside, though, is in the absence of that relational web to make some things work, to grease some things, you have a flood of lobbyists now coming in to lobby members, to lobby staff, to make the case for localities, for special interests about why this project and why not that project. And again, it's a really good instance of how changing these rules of participation changes outcomes in what kind of agenda gets made and what gets included. Well, for us here at this show, we are so interested in hearing your questions and your thoughts and your ideas, and we want to encourage you to reach out to us on Twitter, on Facebook, and through old-fashioned email. Please send us your ideas and your questions. Well, that wraps up this episode of Citizen University TV. In our next episode, we're going to take a deep look at power structures, what they are, how we enter them, how we break them, how we change them. We hope you'll join us. Thanks for watching Citizen University TV, and keep tuning in.